Hello, welcome back to the channel. This is Adam coming at you once more, and today I want to talk about the eternal oblivion theory of after death. So there are lots of theories about what happens to us after death, one of the most common being the idea that the universe and its God tend towards justice, and that following one's mortal demise, people will be judged and find themselves, whatever that self is, without their bodies, in heaven or hell. So there's an afterlife. It's a very common idea. Indeed, many accounts of near-death experiences report feelings of warmth and a presence, as well as the more cliché light, walking towards the light and all of that. More frightening still, others report a void or all-encompassing darkness that may roughly equate to a hell of sorts. But as real as such experiences may seem to the minds of those who have them, there are far more mundane explanations, such as the DMT drug release in the brain at the point of death. Extremely powerful, can conjure up images and such, and it's scientifically documented as well. All the religious or philosophical disposition of those experiencing such harrowing scenarios too, so that in conjunction with that could produce some pretty powerful near-death experiences. I find it equally interesting and telling that away from near-death experiences and going into the realm of miracles and visions to the living, the vision's content heavily depends on the experiencer's cultural and religious context. It usually does if you really look into these accounts. It would indeed be very bizarre and fascinating to me anyway, if a member of an uncontacted tribe, for example, in the Amazon or on one of these islands, such as North Sentinelese Island, which is pretty cool. You should definitely look into that. Had a vision of Jesus or the Madonna or Muhammad or something prior to any contact with these religions. Now that would be actually quite interesting, because and if you could prove that there was no prior contact, but it's never the case, is it? I haven't heard of a case of that happening. And even if it does, it's going to be very ambiguous, and people are going to try and plaster tape Jesus or another figure onto some vague image that the person's probably had. But usually the miracle is based within the context of that person. So Catholics will tend to experience a vision of the Madonna or a saint. Muslims, visions appropriate to them, and so on. So it would seem with near-death experiences, it may very well be the case that as the brain and thus the mind begins to shut down, the processes easing the individual towards death uses what it has. So the whole process uses what it has in the brain, the experience and the cultural context and all that. That which seems most comforting to the mind itself, to the person itself. So what will I see when my time comes? As an atheist, presumably with a mind reconciled to the concept of no God, will I see, well, nothing? Is this something to be dreaded? On the first question, I'd have to say no. At the point of death itself, when my body and thus brain is fully shut down and my consciousness and self are no longer present, then it's actually incorrect to suggest that I'll see anything. we cannot know for certain what happens after brain death, but it would be wrong to suggest that all outcomes are equally feasible given that. To say that heaven and hell afterlife is just as feasible as eternal oblivion or the permanent destruction of the consciousness ignores what we know about ourselves. It just does. That I likely won't see or indeed experience anything is based on what we know about seeing and experiencing. Sensory experience being based on the human condition, which ends at the point of death, is denied to me after that death. It simply makes no sense to talk of seeing and experiencing without sight, senses, or a brain to interpret data which is received from the senses and nerves and things like that, and interprets it into impressions about our environment. This outcome of death is also likely given logic and what we know about ourselves. So an afterlife presumably implies a before life. And try as I might, and most thinking people try this too if they like, I can't really recall what it was like or have any memory or experience of what it was like before I existed. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Indeed, even sometime into my own physical existence, I can only recall up to a certain point. So that's my earliest memory and your earliest memory. So effectively, before then, you didn't exist, or at least your perception of yourself only exists from that point. Given this lack of connection to my before life, I am totally justified in assuming that my afterlife will be much the same as my before life. That is irrelevant and unknown to me. Going to be irrelevant to me. Should I or anyone else really dread such an oblivion? To this, I refer to wiser minds. So the philosopher Epicurus on death actually said, quote, "If I am, then death is not. If death is, then I am not. Why should I fear that which can only exist when I do not?" End quote. Similarly, arguably the father of Western philosophy, Socrates, when considering the possibilities of death at his trial, saw two main outcomes, both of which he was reconciled to, and which I happen to agree with. So firstly, that if there is indeed an afterlife, and that in it he'll meet all of the other great men of the past, that's good, and he'll be able to debate with them, and this possibility quite excites him. But the second possibility is that he considered oblivion. But he said even if this is so, it would be like a dream, like a deep and dreamless sleep that would last forever, so why should it trouble him? So it's a similar sentiment to Epicurus. That such a permanent fate awaits us, then, is not some dark gaping chasm to be feared. These men were not talking of any experience or continued existence in that scenario, but a lack thereof. Death, it can be surmised then, is much like when you sleep. Loosely analogous anyway. You feel your heavy eyes close and then awake sometimes with the feeling that not much time has passed, except in that case you never awake, but you experience this weird lack of awareness and experience nonetheless. If it's even right to talk about experiences, it's a bit of a mind twister, this one. So time, as with all else then, is an experienced condition of existence as far as we are concerned. I then will no more miss the trillions, or to some estimates, Googleplexes worth of years after my death than I do the 6 or 7 hours while in deep sleep. That such a likely outcome is anathema to many, if not most, is largely due to a fear of the dying process, as opposed to the state of death itself, two very different things. And another major factor I outline momentarily, as it is likely that you too reject this oblivion fate on these bases, whether or not you admit to yourself this is the case. Before we begin, indignation, by the way, is not an argument. So you can get angry at this kind of approach if you like, but that's not an argument. You need compelling evidence to back up claims of afterlives or the truth of your particular belief system or religion, of which there are many, by the way, and not all of which can be right. Can they, by definition? If you've got lots of different competing ideologies, lots of different competing religions about what happens after you die, not every single one of them can be right, logically speaking, can they? Some of them are mutually exclusive. Extraordinary claims also require extraordinary evidence, so it's no good just saying, "Oh, I had a vision and I'm just supposed to drop down and believe you." It's ridiculous. Also, don't get me wrong here, I'm not immune to these compulsions. I just choose to confront and talk about them. So I'm afraid of dying. Definitely, I'm scared to death. Pardon the pun. What kind of death will I have? What kind of man wouldn't be scared of the dying process, of the unknown, of course. But that's very different from being dead. It's a very different thing, isn't it? One's a process and one's the finished and permanent state. That we may suffer in this process psychologically requires in most of us some justification for it, which leads to my second major point. Injustice. It's hard to admit a lack of an afterlife, a heaven and a hell, based on the experience of the vast majority of people who've lived and whoever will live. Most are not happy in some respect. Most will not be rich or famous, which is what a lot of people want. Most likely work jobs that they hate their entire lives. That most of them will be exploited or abused by the more powerful, by their peers at some point. Some have it really hard. So the vast majority of people who have ever lived, they reckon about 100 billion people have existed, 100 billion Homo sapiens or modern humans have existed. The vast majority of them probably wouldn't see their 25th birthday. A lot of them not even their 10th. A lot of them would have died in childhood. Indeed, up up until fairly recently, in the medieval period, it was common for children to die. You could have 10 children and only 2 or 3 survive to adulthood. So, this is all due to disease, probably violence, their teeth, things like that. How can such a world then just be? It seems brutally unjust to our human perspective, doesn't it? So such arbitrary suffering and injustice must be rectified. You'd think so, but it's just something that rankles, isn't it? It's extremely hard to accept, yet it may very well be the case, whatever way we feel about it. I don't like it either. We want to believe that there's some other overarching justice to it all deep down, which is why propositions such as Oblivion and the people who support them are likely hated, or at least piss a lot of people off. The truth, sadly and ironically enough, is that justice is only what we create while we're here, or at least that's very likely the case. I think it's largely based on these 2 factors that support for this most likely answer for what happens at death is quite low compared to other choices, other perspectives. However, I submit to you that not only is this fate likely, but preferable to any infinite existence somehow experiencing and perceiving away from your body and brain that allows this. Oblivion, to me anyway, provides a finality and permanence that heavily puts our lives into perspective, and urges us to each live our lives to the fullest, in whatever way we deem good. That all of us inevitably reach this fate of non-existence is also a great equalizer, and in the context of the vastness of existence itself, our small lives, and even those of the great and terrible among us, are actually of very little consequence, if any, in the vast scheme of the universe, I mean. So the universe and the timescales it operates on are vastly beyond any human being's imagining. And we occupy a tiny razor thin slice of this existence. The totality of existence has been for around 13.8 billion years, and that's just the inflationary phase that we know of. And according to most estimates, will continue to be or exist for trillions, if not Googleplex's worth of years. To put all that in some kind of perspective, it takes about 11 days, 13 hours to count 1 number per second to 1 million. To count to 1 billion would take about 30 years, just over 30 years. And if we up this number of this counting, just sat there and started counting one number per second to 1 trillion, if you tried counting this number, it would actually take about 31,500 years, just to put these numbers in perspective. And 1 trillion, by the way, is a puny number in the game of estimating the universe's ultimate lifespan, with some estimates going far beyond that. So you're talking about Google's, which is a 1 followed by 100 zeros, and a Googleplex, which is a Google to the order of a Google. So crazy numbers that some of these smart folk are talking about. So what's the point? Well, the universe may endure for an incredibly horrific amount of time, but you won't be around to endure with it. Not only will you, me, and any other thinking brain won't be around to endure this, but we won't miss much, and we're not there to endure it. You just simply won't be. You, I, and even the most famous and great among us, even those men and women you believe are effectively immortal and will never be forgotten, will be forgotten and return to the exact same state as us. So all your Caesar, Alexander, or Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all of these huge individuals that have such a cultural impact, this great fame, all the great and good and the bad as well will ultimately fall into the same nothingness as everyone else. So don't worry about what you can't change, and take comfort from the fact that whatever you do, ultimately none of it matters in the very end. This eventual and equal equilibrium of nothingness should not be a fate that inspires dread, but actually should be a spur to live your life the way you want to live, in the comfort that any mistakes you make, as well as hurts you suffer, will dissolve into the rest of an unperceiving and endless anonymity. So thanks for listening. I'm going to do another video on the implications of an eternal afterlife or an endless universe quite soon, and from the contrarian viewpoint, just to spice things up a bit. So keep an eye out for that, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you very much.